Thank you very much, Sarah. Thanks to the organizers. This is really good. Thank you, Jerry. Thank you, Nancy, and everybody else. A very stimulating environment in which we are. I want to do three things. One, give a brief history of the environment development thinking through the lens of the history of the World Bank. Second, to talk about a very important transition that's occurred in the last 3 years relating to our understanding of the global environment and the decline of the notion of incremental costs. And third, to talk about the future and to basically pick up on some of the things that Nancy Birdsall talked about yesterday and to take it from there. First, what I won't do is tell you how important the environment is, because I'm sure you all believe that already. We've had a great 2 decades in terms of traditional development, but we've lost tropical forests equivalent to the size of Argentina. We now have critical water scarcity in many, many areas. There's twice as much cement in the world as at the time of the original Rio Earth Summit. And this year, not only NOAA, but NASA and many scientific organizations gave the clearest statements from science so far as to the costs of what climate change is doing already. NOAA in particular put out a very important report that scientifically, for the first time ever, showed that a specific extreme weather event, the drought in Texas, was almost certainly caused by climate change. That's never been done before. So I'm not going to try and persuade you that it's important. The good news, by the way, is that apparently 68% of Americans believe that extreme weather events are getting worse and are caused by human-induced climate change. So it's a good job that President Obama said the 2 words climate change in his convention speech. We need it said a lot more. We need a lot more courage all round in this area. First, the history. 30 years ago this year, I was a very young economist working for the World Bank in Indonesia. The president of the World Bank then, A.W. Clausen, visited. The longest-serving environment minister in the world, Emil Salim, approached him and said, "You're the powerful World Bank. I need your help on environment. Here's what's going wrong. What can you do for me?" And the president said, "I'm sorry, we're a development agency. We don't do environment, but we could certainly point you towards those that do." Now, a total and utter lack of understanding of the link between development and the environment. And then 3 very important things happened in the next 8 years or so. Or 10 years. One was the dams problem, Narmada in particular. Second was the Brundtland report, which came out in 1987. And third was the preparation and then the Rio Earth Summit itself in 1992. So the World Bank started to get serious. We wrote a World Development Report that I was responsible for. Nancy actually was an intellectual light in that as well. In 1992 for the Earth Summit, for the first time tried to capture the understanding that we and the academic world had on the link between environment and development. And so if you like, the 6 or 7 years after the Rio Earth Summit were sort of glory days in the sense that the World Bank pushed enormous resources into the environment. And the environmental portfolio in biodiversity, in especially air pollution, rose from almost 0 to 10 billion. And I remember David Differanti, who was then the director of health for the World Bank, coming to see me as director of the environment department then, and he said, "You're spending, or the World Bank is spending $3.5 billion on air pollution, and you are claiming it's all in the name of health, and the justification is health." He said, "If I had that $3.5 billion, I could spend it better for health than you can on environment." And it's an interesting question, because perhaps he was right. Those huge expanded projects, they did okay, but then they declined thereafter for a number of interesting reasons. But during that period, we had both a big emphasis on the do no harm, so really the codification of safeguards became very, very important in those days. And incidentally, it was the environment school in the World Bank that then spawned the social development. So it was the Environment Department of the World Bank that created a unit for social development, for the social safeguards, for resettlement. That was all under environment in those days. And then we launched it into a separate department. So there was the do no harm side, but there was also a great deal of excitement about the do good side. So that's when, for example, we launched the Where is the True Wealth of Nations initiative. We went through all the national accounts, adjusted them. It was never taken up, unfortunately, by very many countries, or at least maybe a footnote on page 37 of the national accounts, and that's what we're trying to change now. That's the time also when we introduced carbon trading. First time 5 years before the Kyoto Protocol made it legal, if you like, voluntary carbon markets were created by the prototype carbon fund. So very exciting times. Where are we today? Well, by contrast, and by the way, I'm now going to come on and talk about the problems, but by contrast to the original Rio in 1992, when the World Bank booth at Rio was actually burned down by NGOs. And they sort of had a point because they felt that the World Bank was more part of the problem than part of the solution. By contrast, 3 months ago in the Rio +20, the World Bank was pushing NGOs, pushing countries to be more aggressive. Because the World Bank felt that there wasn't anywhere near enough passion at the Rio +20. It was passive in its spirit. And so the World Bank was trying to get 60 countries to sign up to real incorporation of natural capital accounting in their national accounts, using NGOs, calling NGOs, urging them to call the White House in order to get the United States so a huge change. So that's point number one, if you like. And by the way, a huge journey still to go. I want to make that quite clear. Point number two, during this whole period, the assumption was that global issues were really needed to be solved financially by rich countries. And the view was, epitomized in the creation of the Global Environment Facility, the view was that incremental cost, i.e. the extra cost of doing it better, needed to be financed by rich countries in the form of grants. And so all the way up to Copenhagen, when you remember in Copenhagen 3 years ago, $100 billion were promised by rich countries to poor countries, the poor countries, developing countries, assumed that that was going to be grants from rich countries to poor countries and would pay the incremental cost. Well, in the 3 years since then, there's been a huge change in attitudes for several reasons. One, it's been demonstrated that developing countries themselves actually are very willing to borrow for climate change and for environmental issues, and actually they're getting on with it. Two, the amount of money simply that is needed is not going to be there at all from the rich countries. And three, we've demonstrated through, for example, the climate investment funds, which is a $7 billion pot of money that the United States, the United Kingdom, and Japan, plus some other countries, put in to the World Bank, for the World Bank and the regional banks to implement. And that is all being implemented in the form of loans that are subsidized, guarantees, even equity. So a much richer set of possibilities. Why is this relevant? Well, it's relevant because it implies what could be the future for the World Bank and why this is important. Consider last year, $300 billion worldwide invested in renewable energy. Half of that in the developing world. So developing and emerging world. $150 billion invested. Now, what was the incremental cost of that, i.e. the cost of going solar rather than using coal or whatever? Don't know, but probably something approaching $50 billion. So who was paying the extra money in order to make those investments? Was it some international fund? Was it rich countries? Not at all. It was actually developing countries themselves, often in the form of feed-in tariffs or just government subsidies. Why is it that this year China is introducing cap and trade in 4 cities and 3 provinces, and will be nationwide cap and trade by 2015. And by 2020, they've said, we want to be part of a networked carbon market. Why do they want to do that? Must be because they think it's in their own interest. And if you go to the mayor of Tianjin and you say to him, you surely were unhappy when they asked you to be one of the pilot cities, he will say, not at all. We all wanted to be. I believe Tianjin can become the center of technology and so on. That's honestly what they believe. I won't give you my judgment of whether that's possible, although, I certainly hope it's possible. Why is it that Morocco is borrowing several $100 million to invest in concentrated solar that will cost 25 cents a kilowatt hour when they could get it for less than half of that? It's because they believe something dynamic is happening. They also believe they're going to be able to sell it into the European feed-in tariff market, and it will become a major export commodity. So there's something very dynamic that is going on here, whereby developing countries are no longer saying, except, by the way, in the negotiations where they're still saying it, but developing countries are getting on with it. They want to be part of the solution. Now, this has a lot of implications now for the final part of what I want to talk about, which is sort of the future for the World Bank. 4 years ago, people were saying, look, what you absolutely mustn't do is take money for climate change that's going to flow from a rich country to an emerging or a developing country and call that ODA, because it's not right. It should be kept totally in separate buckets. So there's climate finance, there's official development assistance, and surely that's right, because if adaptation is caused by bad behavior, if the effect of climate change is caused by bad behavior of rich countries, surely moral, compunction drives the fact that this should be it's not part of official development assistance. Same too, perhaps even more so on the mitigation side. Plain fact of the matter now is basically every single dollar of money that's going for climate change from rich countries to poor countries, except that which is coming from the private sector, is coded as official development assistance. Now, that sounds bad, but on the other hand, if you start factoring this idea that developing countries now see investment in climate change, adaptation, and mitigation as part of their development endeavor, it may not be a bad thing. And the way to look at this, if you think about the developing and emerging world, let's imagine, roughly speaking, gross domestic investment for the next 10 years will be, say, $10 trillion a year. Think of that, 10 trillion. That's all the investment from what a poor farmer does all the way up to a super highway system. That's how much investment roughly will be, maybe slightly less than that. How should we think through climate finance? Well, almost every single segment of that needs to be adjusted one way or the other. If it's agriculture, you've got to do pest management different, you've got to do water management different, you've got to have investment in new seeds. If it's energy, clearly it's got to be radically changed. If it's cities and urban development, you need to do it quite differently. Some areas you don't have to do it very much, just little tweaks. Other areas you need to do it a lot. What will be the incremental cost above and beyond the old-fashioned way of doing it to get the same short-term output? Don't know, but the best estimates suggest something like $500 billion. So in other words, 10 trillion total, the incremental costs say $500 billion. Now, how do you inject that? What you can't do is have a separate pot and projectize it, because it needs to be injected all the way through the entire value chain in every single sector. So you have to change the way that the system works, rather than say, okay, Ministry of Environment, you run this great big pot of money, because in a million years they would never, ever be able to get it right across that vast array. And this is where an institution like the World Bank, or some equivalent, needs to play a role. Why? Because they are soup to nuts across the range of sectors and have the capacity to engage at the policy and planning level. And part of this needs to move from projects to programs, whereby, for example, on adaptation, instead of saying we're going to have an adaptation project here in agriculture, Instead, you have a serious discussion as to what it would entail to really put the ideas of resilience throughout your entire planning and budgeting, procurement, implementation, monitoring and evaluation system. And then you inject that money into the general budget and you monitor whether it's going. That's the way we need to think about spending for climate change. And I'm speaking mainly about climate change here, but the same thing applies to other public goods as well. What are the other areas in which the World Bank could play a helpful role? And by the way, just on that, moving to program side, the idea of climate change and global public goods, DPLs, development policy loans, can be part of this. And the World Bank now has, I think, $8 billion in climate change development policy loans, programmatic loans linked to a results framework that includes policy input, it includes budgetary allocations, and it includes actual impact targets on the ground. What else could the World Bank do? Standard setting. Who is it going to play the role in helping to get all of the appliance manufacturers in the right place to label and so on? It'll happen on its own a little bit, industry associations, but having a player that includes the IFC could play a role on that, or vehicles, or building appliances. Think about what role the World Bank played on the elimination of lead in gasoline in the developing world. The United States took 22 years to phase out lead in gasoline, very, very effectively, eventually. Some countries then took 5 years. Massive countries. I was living in Vietnam for a year. We were working with the Vietnamese. They changed overnight. Why? Because we were able to bring evidence from around the world on the health benefits, the technical side, the issues of lead and knocking and all these kinds of things. So the idea of standard setting, and then that leads to a third sort of almost more ambitious, which is who's actually going to do the monitoring, the reporting, and the verification? I'm not saying the World Bank should, but for example, whether it is in carbon markets, or whether it will be in a post-2020 when the world has agreed it will have a global climate deal that will be effective, there is going to need to be some serious, what's called MRV, and there needs to be institutions that are really part of this. Now, the bank lost, as Nancy was saying last night, the bank lost a great opportunity, maybe 3 or 4 years ago, when what it should have done is establish a new affiliate for global public goods, and it should have had a voting structure that was what the UNFCCC was really wanting. When we set up the climate investment funds, by the way, exactly that, 50-50, and they've been highly effective, I believe. The bank chose not to do that. It's now probably too late because there's now a green fund coming down the path. The first board meeting was held 2 months ago. The fear is that it will have dozens and dozens of implementing agencies. It will develop a big secretariat, and it will be focused precisely on, if you like, treating climate change as if it's a sector rather than the approach that I was talking about before, where it needs to be embedded across a whole array. And what the challenge is that we need to get that green fund to work with the World Bank and other MDBs in a way that really would be effective. Just one final point in the 30 seconds I have left. Look, there are going to be new goals, we hope. This week in New York, David Cameron, Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono and President Johnson Sirleaf had their first meeting. We spent some time with President Yudhoyono talking to him about what will these goals look like. Now, if we have a view that there's a sort of an economic goal and there's a social goal, an environmental goal, the way the UN is thinking about it, we will lose the battle. It is only when we see these three coming together that we will have any chance of success. But that's for another afternoon. Thank you very much.